Hey guys, Wintermute here, and today we'll be making star spirals in EEVEE. Now, you probably all know by this point that EEVEE can't actually handle object motion blur, it can only do motion blur to the camera, so we're going to be using the screw modifier and some shader magic to fake it. So, let's get started. So, I'm just going to start up a new project. I'll turn on my screencast keys. And we're going to start by deleting the default cube. Sorry about that default cube. And let's start messing with the background. Make sure that your render engine is set to EEVEE. And then we're going to go to this shading tab. We'll hit use nodes. And this is what the background looks like right now. You can see that we can change the strength and everything. So I'm going to make this pretty simple. All we want is a gradient texture, which will give us a white to black gradient like you can see here. We're also going to put the camera at the top of the screen, so we're going to do that by hitting Ctrl-Shift-O. Well, you'll probably want to have 7 also selected, and we'll change this camera into an orthographic projection. Okay, so to make sure this gradient is oriented correctly, we'll use a mapping node. Oops. And we can plug in a texture coordinate. We'll plug in window into the vector, which is basically the screen that we're looking at right now. And we can give it a rotation of -90. Oops. Maybe. Okay, you might have to mess with these numbers a bit. -90 degrees on the z-axis. Oh, well, I guess the z-axis is pointing up, so that makes sense. But you'll notice that this gradient is the same no matter where we are, so it's sort of in the screen space. Anyway, so we'll go back to the camera view by pressing 0 on the number pad, and you can see our gradient here. So to change this gradient color, all we have to do is add a ColourRamp. And so I picked out some colors beforehand. You can pick these or whatever else you want, doesn't really matter. So I'm going to start with 040A06, which is pretty close to dark green, I don't know. And then this upper bound, we'll set it as 121 F27. And we have a sort of like dark sky sort of texture. You can also change this rotation to give it a bit more interest if you want, so it's not like vertically across the screen. It doesn't really matter too much. Alright, so now let's start by making the actual effect. So we're going to want to create an empty at the center of the screen, and this is what everything is going to rotate around. Then we're going to add in a circle. And so an important thing here, we're going to have a lot of these circles and there's not too much optimizations that can be done. So we're going to have to turn down the vertices a lot because in your scene you're going to have probably hundreds of thousands. So maybe we'll change this to 12 vertices for now. And we're going to leave it unfilled. Then, so you can see that if we add the screw modifier. Okay, well, let's scale it down first. So you can see that if we add the screw modifier now, where are you? Screw modifier. Okay, it's not really doing too much. It's kind of on the wrong axis too, and so we don't want it to rotate around its own axis. We want it to rotate around this axis, so it'll screw in a large circle around the origin of the world. So in order to do that, we can just set the axis object to our empty. And you can see that we have this rotation. So you might already have an idea of what we're going to do here. We're going to keyframe this angle variable to some amount, and we're going to have a lot of these stars around the scene. So you also want to turn up the render steps because this will make it look a lot smoother on this angle part. If you want, you can keep it down at 16 before, which should be fine. I wouldn't suggest you go too low though, because you're going to start getting polygons instead of circles, or approximate circles, I guess. You also want to keep in mind that having too many render steps is going to slow this down a lot. You can see that we already have 156 vertices with 1 star. So that's a lot. Multiply that by, I had 800 stars in that scene that you saw at the start, so that will be a lot. So now you can scale down this star object to something really quite small. And yeah, there we go. That's our 1 star that's curved. And you can have this max curvature go up to 360 degrees if you like, but I think it's probably good to keep this around maybe 75 degrees. I don't want the stars to do like a whole revolution, because then we're just going to have a bunch of concentric circles on the screen and that won't look very good. And now you'll see that if we duplicate this around, that it forms more of these arcs, but these aren't really doing anything. Okay, let's delete this light for now. We are not going to need any lighting in the scene. And you can see all these concentric arcs sort of around the scene. But how are we going to make these stars have a sort of motion blur effect? So if you look at the head of the star right now where it's moving, we want that part to be brighter than the rest of the scene. And the way we're going to do that is by playing with the geometry. So my idea was to take this star or take the screw, and using the actual screw modifier, we can give it a negative value and make it go downwards. And then we can extract from the position information in the object data, we can extract the Z value of the actual star, and then we can color it with a gradient. So we'll have it darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. Or alternately, if we want to have the head of the star brighter, we'll have it darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. So let's start with that. So you can see I have a fairly large screw value. It kind of depends on the scale of your scene. I kind of just picked a random scale because my camera is quite a bit above, or I guess that doesn't matter too much with an orthographic camera. But anyways, this screw value might be pretty high. You can set it pretty arbitrarily, I think. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to be playing with this screw value and exploiting the fact that it gives us a change in the Z position of the particle or of the object in order to color it with a gradient. Okay, so let's make the material for this now. So you want to set this to object, and we can create a new object. We'll call it star. And so the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to add an emission shader. And so this is our streak. So again, I said I want to have it darker at this end and lighter at this end. Maybe I'll bring it a bit closer. And so there's not really a way to make a radial gradient based on like time. And since each of these circles are going to be in different positions, there's really no way to do this. So instead, we can do it based on height. And you can see that due to the way we've set up the scene, the furthest part of the star along the animation is the highest part as well, since we've given it a positive screw value, which will just make it spiral upwards. So if we go back into the camera view and we select our object again, now we have to get the height data, and this is a pretty useful trick you can use. We can use the geometry node, and then we can plug in a separate XYZ node into the position. And now this output is going to give us our Z value. So you can already see this having an effect. You don't really need to do too much to this now. And you can see that if we turn this up, that gradient effect is kind of scaling along the axis, along the star path. And if we move it up and down, we can see that it sort of cuts off at the XY plane where Z is equal to 0. And if we move it up, the whole thing will be bright. Now we can kind of modulate this effect by using a ColourRamp. and we're going to be using a lot of color ramps in this tutorial. And now you can see that if we shift this upwards, it'll become darker towards the tail. And we don't want it to be super dark anywhere. So we're going to just have it have a slightly lower brightness. And we're going to move that effect up. You don't want to have this be too sharp though, because you'll see like a defined crease. So instead, maybe we'll move this to the back, and we can turn the maximum brightness down a bit, maybe. And this we can actually plug into our strength, as this actually returns a value between 0 and 1. And we can turn on bloom, perhaps, to see this a bit better. We add a multiply. So we have to add a math node, and we'll switch the mode to multiply. And then we can use this to sort of scale the effect. So this will give us a number from 0 to 1 along this color ramp, and we can scale it up or scale it down depending on what we want. So this is going to be obviously pretty overwhelming if we have 800 of these stars. So we're going to scale this down a bit, maybe down a lot. I think it would be a good idea to have these stars just generally having a fairly dark sort of look, because if you have them too bright, it's going to be, as I said, overwhelming. So we also want the head of the star to be especially bright. So one way we can do that is that we can add an extra step at the end here and turn this up a lot. And then we will get a sort of crease at the point where it hits that. So you can see that it kind of turns a bit brighter, closer to the end. And we can always manipulate that effect. And we can always scale this down so we have a star about that big. Now, if you want to have slightly random colors to the stars, because I don't think I want them all to be super white, we can just duplicate this color ramp, put this into the color node. And to get a random number, this is a trick to do it. We go to object info, and there's your random output, and it just gives you a random number between 0 and 1, which then gives us a position of this slider along this curve. And so if we have multiple of these, and I'll show you, for example, by, I'll just turn this to something like green, for example, or blue, I guess. And then I'll duplicate this a bunch of times, and you can see that we have a bunch of sort of random looking colors. Maybe if I turn this orange. So you can see that we have random colors all the way along this gradient. So we obviously don't want this particular color setup. I think it would be good to go with sort of white to very, very subtle-ish blue. And you can always return it to white by turning down the saturation to 0, or pretty much 0, and then setting this to blue. And then we'll have a pretty slight variation on the brightness. Alright, so now let's animate this. This is pretty easy. We'll go to our angle at 0. We'll hit I to keyframe it there, and we're going to make this 10 seconds long, say. So at frame 240, since we're going at 24 frames per second, I think. 24 frames per second that you can see here. We'll just go to the screw modifier at frame 240, and we'll set this angle to the final angle that we want it at. So I said something like 75 before, and I'm just going to go with that. So each of our stars is going to look like this at the end. And now, we just need a lot of them. Or rather, before we do that, maybe we want a North Star. So an easy way to do that is just to make another circle, fill it in, scale it way down, so it's about the size of the other things. So maybe like that. And we'll give it a new material, set this to emission, and turn up this value a bit. Okay, so you can see it there. And we have all of our other stars are going to be revolving around it, while this one doesn't really turn at all. So I'm not sure of any way to do this except just duplicating these one by one. So you're just going to have to do that unless anyone has a smarter idea, like using a particle system maybe and applying it, or some sort of array modifier. So yeah, if any of you have ideas, please let me know in the comments, but if you don't, then we're going to be duplicating these by hand. So you can hit Alt-D to make an instance. Oh, and we haven't watched the animation yet, so you can see that our stars are arcing this way, and they get progressively brighter as they hit their peak. And so we just want a lot of these. So now that we have two, we can duplicate those two. Make sure to use Alt-D and not Shift-D so we have instances. So make a couple more. We can actually go into the side view if you like, and select these ones, deselect the empty, and let's keep going. So in total you want about, say, 700 or 800 of these stars. Make sure you have a good, reasonable looking spread, so you can select a big clump over here and you can move it wherever you like. And we'll just move a lot around our central star. Maybe a little bit more. And it's always going to be a bit harder to fill in things close to the middle, unless you have something really densely packed. Even then, might not work. Careful not to duplicate your camera either, because that might be a bit problematic. And you can see that I have like 90,000 vertices in my scene, which isn't great, but you know, what can you do? If, again, anyone has ideas about optimizations to this effect, you can let me know, but this looks pretty cool, at least from this perspective. And we can see that since we're in EEVEE, doing this in cycles would take actually forever. Since we're in EEVEE, we can do this and we can actually watch it in real time, which is really cool. And this looks quite similar to the motion blur effect that you'd expect. And so we have all of these stars sort of revolving around our North Star. Another thing we might want to do is we can give all of these stars a slight amount of rotation at the end. So let's go to the 0th or the first frame. We'll keyframe the rotation right now, and you'll see that these are all sort of straight lines because they have an angle of 0 degrees, so they're basically straight. It's a segment of a circle, or not a segment, I guess, just a vertex of a circle extruded along its normal axis. So we'll just take everything here, and let's just rotate it by like 15 degrees on the z-axis, so RZ 15, and then we'll keyframe that rotation. And hopefully that doesn't do anything too weird. Or if it does anything at all, who knows. Anyways, so there you have it. Now we have some stars, which is pretty cool. You might want to keyframe the brightness of this so that it doesn't actually look like there's no other stars there and they just fade into existence. So we can turn this down to, say, 0.5. at the first frame, and then as all the other stars start appearing, we'll turn this back up to its actual color of 4. And yeah, so we've just made motion blur without actually using motion blur because EEVEE doesn't have motion blur for objects. Now, there are a couple more things we can do here to just polish the scene a little bit. We can make some modifications to the colors by adding a medium high or very high contrast to our scene. You'll note that we can't actually see the sky too well right now. We can also turn up the gamma a little bit in order to increase the level of the mid-tones. And if you want, we can go into our compositing node and we can add some glare. So this is just going to be on top of our So let's render this first. So this is just going to be on top of the bloom that we have. So let's open up our render results. And we can turn this threshold down a bit. And you just want to sort of fine tune this to your own preferences, but yeah, so this is sort of how this effect can be made in Blender without actually using motion blur, and it can be done extremely quickly. Now there are always a couple of changes you might want to make yourself. You might want to make some of the ends a bit darker. For example, this is not significantly different in value than this top part. So you might want to change that color ramp to be a bit darker at this end. And you can always turn down the multiply value or move this up. You just don't want to have everything too bright, otherwise it's kind of difficult for the person that's looking to know what the heck is going on. Also, to save on render time, if you see any stars like really far out of your screen, you can just straight up delete them because they're not actually going to be rendered, so they're just going to eat processing time for no reason. Alright, so I think that'll be the end of the tutorial. If you make this, let me know how it goes, and yeah, I hope this tutorial has helped you, and you make something cool with it. Also, for some progress on I've Digital, shifting my website over from WordPress, so in case any of you have been reading my website in the past, you'll notice that I've put up this notice that I'm going to be moving away from WordPress to Hugo, and I'm going to code all of this myself, as I'm currently doing. CSS is really not a lot of fun. So I'm going to be changing this website over, and I just want to give you guys a sneak peek of how this looked right now, as opposed to what it was before. So this is sort of my current website. You can check it out at wintermutedigital.com, at least for the next 6 days. And right now what I'm going to do is I'll give you a look at what this will look like once this finishes building. Alright. So this will be my new site. It looks definitely a lot different. And it's still a work in progress. I'll be porting over all of my blog posts and everything, so don't worry about that, they'll all be there. And I'll have a section for my portfolio as well as for a couple of tutorials. You can see how to make all of these things pretty much on my YouTube channel if you just look around. And yeah, so that's what I've been working on for a quick update. So if this has helped you, please leave a like and subscribe maybe, and thanks for watching. See you next time.